there's two types of people in the world. There's people with problems and people with solutions. My dad taught me that early on, and it's one of the cornerstones of how we do things here. I want to know the driver's problems. I want to know what those obstacles are. And if I can bring a value, it's going to come from solving those problems.
Chicken trucking, big wheels there humming, high rate of fuel consumption, missing mama, needing loving, rolling with the wailing sound, running like the southern shaker. I don't need no 40 acres to turn this rig around.
Welcome back to Trucking Fitness Radio, the #1 driver's health and fitness podcast in the world. My name is Dr. Mark Manera. I am the founder and CEO of the Trucking Fitness Company, and I'm excited to have you listening to this episode. As you're aware, we are on a mission to make the trucking industry a healthier place, and this podcast is just one of the ways that we're doing that. And today we've got a good friend and awesome guest on the podcast, Charles Gracey, the president of Hot Seat Services, that he started after growing up in the trucking industry and actually driving himself, but I'll let him tell the story. Charles, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, man, I'm excited to have this conversation. And I guess before we get too deep, tell everyone a little bit about your background and how you got into the trucking industry.
Well, great. I grew up in it. It was one of those things, going to work with my dad and learning about trucking from a family aspect of it, and seeing the old school drivers, going to work with him, learning about the clients and the relationships, and then just progressed from there through exposure. And I think it's something that's often lost in this industry.
Yeah. And how long, and you were in the Navy, correct?
Yeah.
Well, thank you for your service, first of all. And was that directly out of high school, and then you kind of transitioned into the trucking industry, or tell a little bit more detail?
Yeah, so directly out of military school, went into the military, got injured, got out, and then kind of went to college for something completely different. Went to college for hospitality.
Okay.
And fell back into trucking because I grew up in it, and I felt very comfortable in it. And went in as a driver, progressed from being a driver to accidentally getting injured on my own time. And someone realized I had some potential, so they moved me in the office. And then it kind of just grew from there. Originally started out training drivers after I got out of the truck, and developing driver training programs. And I remember trying to be a recruiter without permission and posting a job ad, and I got reamed for it. And if you fast forward another year, I'm now a recruiter, and then became the recruiting manager, and then recruiting director, and then director of people. So it quickly progressed because I had a passion for dealing with the drivers. I was known as the driver's guy. So I always gravitated towards the drivers because that's where I started.
Yeah. And was that a tough transition from going from a driver to the office, or was it something you saw yourself doing, or what was kind of the internal conversation you were having with yourself?
It was never in the plan. I'm glad it worked out the way it did, but it was never in the plan. It was a fluke, and as it happened and progressed, I enjoyed it, and I kind of made it my own. And then I took my experiences from being a driver and I tried to apply it to the office, just trying to make stuff make sense. And it's not always an easy transition because people always look at you, oh, you're just a driver. And then they quickly realize that maybe that vantage point or viewpoint, when you bring it into the office, allows them to grow as a company as well as you as an individual. So finding that right niche and balance with them was tricky in the beginning, but once I found it and found my stride, it just kind of clicked, and wouldn't trade it for the world.
That's awesome. And then you started Hot Seat 2 years ago, right?
Yes.
That's awesome. Cool.
Started Hot Seat. It was just supposed to be me trying to have some more time at home with my family and trading in my executive level position. And it just grew and had so much momentum because it was all about servicing the drivers, finding them their forever home. And from that point forward, it just turned into the marketing that I had a lot of background in, turning into the recruiting. Our carrier list grew. Our reputation for the first 2 years grew just off referrals alone.
Yeah. And I think that's kind of the whole conversation I wanted to have today. And the reason why I wanted to bring you on was talking about honestly smelling out the BS when it comes to recruiters. And I think that that's something that you've been, become an expert in, and had, a lot of time, experiencing it firsthand, and also probably hearing the, nightmare stories of that. But before we kind of get into that, you told me the story when we hung out a couple of weeks ago at Matt's, and I need you to tell it on air about Truck You, and tell that story.
So I was working for a carrier, and I was in charge of the marketing. I was in charge of the recruiting, in charge of the retention, and they wanted to do a complete rebranding. They wanted to get everything rebranded to geared towards drivers. And so they came to me. I was swamped. I was absolutely swamped. And they had gone several times through different little notions of what they wanted to put on the back of their trailers to promote getting into trucking. And I remember sitting there, I was going through a whole big marketing push that we're getting at, and the owner had come in and he's like, "Hey, I need an idea. You have to present me with 2 ideas." And I'm like, "Go truck yourself." It was just a joke. And it actually wound up on the ballot of things we were voting on. After it made it on the ballot of things we were voting on, and then it wound up on the back of the trailer one day. I remember seeing it and I'm like, "Oh wow, this is actually happening." I'm like, either I'm going to get fired or I'm going to get a pat on the back and a data boy for this.
Yeah.
Luckily, it was the better of the options.
Awesome.
But we wound up having it on shirts. We wound up having it on the back of the trailer, and it was all about being fun. It was one of those, again, happy accidents. But it just goes to how we like to handle things, or how I personally like to handle things when it's regarding marketing for drivers. Not everything has to be so suit and tie. Sometimes you could just make it fun for the drivers, and the drivers had a blast with it. They thought it was the greatest thing since sliced bread.
Yeah, I mean, I can imagine maybe a couple of grandmas driving down the highway might have been a little upset about that, or offended, if you want to put it that way. But
they were.
I'm sure you got a higher call to action rate of drivers being like, "I want to work for that company," versus the, "Oh, welcome to drive for X company." And it's just like this generic thing. That's funny.
Yeah, they loved it. We got a lot of calls. We did get some of the grandmas that like, "Well, we'll never work with you guys." And I'm like, "I'm sorry you feel that. It's just about getting yourself into trucking. You're reading into it too much." But the drivers, the response from them was great. They thought it was great that someone did some marketing that related to what their interests are and what they find fun, and just finding a little humor in the job that sometimes often is too serious.
Well, the good news for that company is most of those Karens probably don't need too much freight moved. So you probably didn't lose out on too much. But kind of getting into the recruiting side of things. And I know that's kind of something that is can be a scary thing for drivers, scary thing for someone. Getting a new job is scary in general, but, having this person who's honestly the representative for that company and saying, "This is how it's going to be." And oftentimes, or sometimes, and unfortunately, when you get to the other side, it's not crystal 1-to-1 exactly how the recruiter was, giving those expectations. So talk to me about, what are some of the most common things that go wrong with the relationship with a recruiter and a driver?
Absolutely. One of the first things a driver is going to encounter after getting their CDL is a recruiter. They might even encounter the recruiter before even getting the CDL. It's not the ideal situation, in my opinion. I think having that CDL and not being tethered to one place is a huge benefit to the driver. But say you're talking to a recruiter, the relationship's going in the right direction if they're listening to you, if they're answering your questions, and if they're getting back to you with truthful answers. That you don't want the answers that pertaining to the top 1% of drivers. There's always those go-getters. If a carrier's telling you, "Hey, our top 1% makes 200K a year," you're not going to be in that top 1%, especially when you first start. There's a learning curve to trucking, and anyone that tells you otherwise isn't looking out for your best interest. They're doing you a disservice. So turning around and having that conversation with real numbers, averages, those are the conversations that often I see a lot of drivers leave behind. They just want to hear about the cents per mile. They just want to hear about the home time. And those things are important, don't get me wrong. But having that conversation about, hey, what's the average driver making? Understanding that, yes, you're guaranteed that you're going to be home every week, but this is trucking. Something may go wrong. And knowing how that carrier is going to handle it when it goes wrong is just as important to know how they're going to handle it when everything goes right. Because this is life. Not everything goes as planned.
Yeah, I mean, 100%. And I, when you were talking about that, I was having a conversation with a potential partner of the trucking fitness company last week, and something that I took away that I thought was really cool and kind of works perfectly with this is, everyone knows subconsciously, or maybe they're thinking and they're not saying it, that, any relationship, any company, anything, it's not all positive. And I think being open about, hey, here are the negative aspects or the things we're trying to work on that we haven't nailed down right away, but being upfront with it, I think, for a lot of people, that is like freeing and, shows like the human aspect of it. And, probably 9 out of 10 times they're not deal breakers. And it probably just builds more loyalty with that driver because they're like, oh, okay, well, that's not that big of a difference. And they're being very upfront with me.
Absolutely. And transparency is key in the recruiting. People that aren't very transparent, it shows on the surface. And it's something drivers should be looking at as a red flag, just like recruiters are trained to look at red flags. A lot of times, some of those red flags are outdated, like work history and stuff. COVID has changed a lot of these standards, unemployment gaps, stuff like that. But just like recruiters are trained to look for red flags, drivers need to be looking for those red flags. So if a recruiter's dodging any questions, get those answers. Who takes a job without getting their answers? We don't. I shouldn't expect the driver to do it either. I need to be going forward and getting them those answers, and they need to be accurate, truthful answers. And then outside of even that, if they don't have the answer, listen to the recruiter and how they respond to that. No recruiter has all the answers, but are they willing to go get you the answer? And if they're not, and they're just like, oh, figure it out in orientation, ask your orientation person, probably need to dial it back and ask some more questions.
Yeah. Yeah. And so then I guess during that process of looking for a new job, do you recommend from a driver to, talking to multiple recruiters? Do you recommend talking to a recruiter that works with multiple companies so that you build that relationship with one recruiter and then they're looking out for you and they're not like super loyal to one company versus another company? How do you from a driver's perspective look at that?
So that's where the value proposition comes into effect for a driver. If you know the carrier that you want to work for, then going directly to that carrier is always going to be a plus because they know their product inside and out. They work directly for them. Yes, there is a loyalty because you either fit in that box or you don't. So they're only selling what's in that box. The value proposition with the third party that has multiple carriers is at that point, the value comes from us being able to present you with what you're looking for. Instead of us just being inside this box, you tell me A, B, C, and D, and I'm looking for A, B, C, and D, and I'm presenting you multiple offers that fit that to pick from. And it becomes the driver's smorgasbord per se, where you get what you want, have it your way. But with that also comes the conversation of sometimes what a driver might be looking for might not be reasonable. And having that conversation, just like telling somebody everything they want to hear is great, but also having that educational conversation about, hey, this is what you're looking for, but it's just not realistic, or at least in this setting, it's not. So that's where what we do for drivers is a lot different, more different than what carriers are going to do for them, because we're going to be able to present them with A, B, C, and D, good things, bad things, get the answers to questions that they might have, let them pick what fits their needs and wants more. And then we can point them in the right direction. Or sometimes it just comes down to education of what they're looking for and how they can achieve it. They might not get it right now, but down the line, they might be able to achieve it if they do A, B, and C to get there.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think, from a driver's perspective, obviously, you mentioned it earlier of, time at home and pay. Those are the obviously the two elephants in the room, but there are some other factors, that from a benefits perspective, from the company's thinking about drivers outside of, where their next load's at. what from if you were a driver, going to a company and talking to recruiters, what are some of those other things outside of family time and pay that you might look for to, get a little bit more under the hood of, is this company, care about drivers? Is this company, caring if I'm gone in 6 months? Are they wanting me to, be here for the long haul, right?
Yeah, no, and you're absolutely right. There's more outside of just paying home time. I'm a big advocate of culture, company culture. I think when a recruiter's recruiting for a company, you're not just talking pay and home time, but you're talking company culture. You want drivers that fit that culture, and drivers need to find a company that fits the culture they're looking for. So the number one thing a recruiter can do and a driver is communicate the culture that's important to them. If it's home time and pay, then great. Those are easy ones to have that conversation. But what about when things aren't that great? What about, hey, I have an emergency at home? Having that conversation up front. Say I have an emergency at home. How flexible are you guys to get me home with the run that you're putting me on? Or is it trucks? If you came from a company where the trucks were always broken down, that affects your pay. If the truck's not running, you can't make money. So finding out how they address those broken trucks is equally as important. And that's where it comes into doing your research as well. Drivers should be researching the companies that they're going for. Check their reviews, check the other things drivers are saying. They need to be doing their homework just like we do on them. If they're not, they're doing themselves a disservice. Looking into those companies that have a driver first mentality, it more than just saying it. Is that company got great benefits for when you're sick? Does that company have some sort of disability? Does that company have some sort of health program to keep you on the road so you can keep making your money? If you're down in a hospital or you're busted up at home, you're not making money. So it's in everyone's best interest to have things in place that promote that kind of environment. Some of the best companies I've worked for might not have been the highest paying one. And that's something that us as carriers need to focus on as well. It's not just about the pay. And it's not just about the home time. Yes, those are the two biggies. But what about the other stuff? Incorporating the driver's family.
Quality of life, making it, obviously people love the life on the road, but living out of a semi is not as comfortable as it, not the most comfortable thing in the world. So what are you doing, as a company to, promote that higher quality of life out there and make it, something that's more sustainable and check some of those boxes that, drivers are able to maybe cook or able to get their workout in or able to, control the temperature, right, and sleep better. I think there's so many different areas, and I think that there are more companies that are thinking about that. And I think, from my perspective, the companies that are thinking about that are thinking long term for drivers. And like I said before, thinking outside of those, home time and pay are like the obvious two. And those are like, everyone has to do that, or you don't cross, you don't go, go past go and collect $200 or whatever. Right. But I guess just from a recruiting perspective and, the relation, I guess the process of, I'm a driver, I get, I talk to a recruiter, I'm excited to work for the company. I go to orientation, get through orientation, and then day one out on the road. And this is not what the recruiter painted the picture to be. What is that conversation like? Yeah. What's your advice for a driver who went through that or who is going through that?
Well, and generally that's going to be the case. This is where the education piece comes in. It's not all rainbows and unicorns and daisies in trucking. There's going to be good days. There's going to be bad days. More often than not, you see those early on. You see those fractures early on. Does that mean you had a bad recruiter? Not necessarily. It just means that there's a transition. There's a learning curve. Just like if a recruiter has the conversation with a driver that, hey, you're going to be making this much money. Well, yes, you potentially can make that much money, but there's a buildup to that point. You're getting to know the carrier is getting to know you. They often throw soft pitches, as I like to call them, in the beginning to allow you to acquaint to them or acclimate to the company. So with that in mind, I always advise drivers, like, don't form your opinion based on the first week or even the first month. Give it a solid 60 to 90 days. That's at that point, a carrier and the driver both know each other. At that point, if things aren't living up to what they've been told to be, then you had some BS tossed your way and the recruiter was maybe not as truthful as you might have liked. But you see it on both sides. I see drivers all the time that, hey, I want to run this many miles. I want to do this. I want to do that. And I think having those conversations early on, setting those expectations early on, it's beneficial not only to the driver, but it's also beneficial to the carrier to have those, because then it's going into the retention platform. And that's where a lot of times recruiting can be a predecessor going into retention, where these guys can set the stage for a successful transition by labeling everything out and setting those expectations ahead of time. Hey, you're not going to make this the first week because you're getting to know us. You might start out with 2,600 miles your first month, but then after that, you could get 32 once you get to know us. So having those real expectations that there might be a curve, I think it's always helpful to have those conversations early on in the process.
Well, yeah. And I think you brought up a good point too, because, from a, I've hired, hiring people on my end, the person who's looking for the job sometimes talks, a bigger game than, when it comes to execution. And so I think that there's, setting those expectations and both people being upfront and honest about, what actually happens after the fact. And I guess, where do you see the balance of throwing those softballs to drivers to get them excited, but also being upfront, especially if they're new to trucking, with this is a tough lifestyle? Where do you see that balance? And
Yeah, so that's a great point, because talking to an experienced driver early on versus a new driver are two different conversations, in my opinion. And my people are trained that way as well, because talking to a new driver, it's constant education, letting them know that what the truck school might have told you, what someone might have told you, that you're going to make 100K right out the CDL school, not really realistic to happen. There are opportunities where you can, but labeling that out for them and letting them know, like, hey, you got to achieve A, B, and C before you can hit D. Versus when I'm talking to an experienced driver, it's a different conversation as well. I'm now talking, hey, this is what you're looking for. This is what we have. That's where one of the lessons I was taught early in life, one of the most important things I think a recruiter can go into this, or driver, is there's two types of people in the world. There's people with problems and people with solutions. My dad taught me that early on, and it's one of the cornerstones of how we do things here. I want to know the driver's problems. I want to know what those obstacles are. And if I can bring a value, it's going to come from solving those problems. So I'm going to go through their past work history. I'm going to ask them why you left here, why you went from here to here to here for the last 3 years. That way I can alleviate a problem that they might not even be asking for. If I see a common thread, that's the thread I want to yank and I want to solve, because then I know I'm going to help them find their new forever home versus the next rock skip along the way.
Yeah, no, I like that. And I like that analogy of the two different people. Tell me a little bit, sell me Hot Seat Services. Tell me a little bit about what you guys do. And
Yeah, so Hot Seat Services is the full cycle recruiting agency. We do everything from driver lead gen marketing to we rent recruiters to carriers that might not have the internal capacity to have in their own. We also do third-party recruiting, where we do full placements directly to a carrier, nothing temp. And then outside of that, we do recruiter training workshops. We're trying to service not only the drivers, but the carriers in any way possible to make this whole driver engagement experience better.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And I've really enjoyed getting to know you a couple of times when we've spoke through Zoom, and then also finally in person at Matt's, a month or two ago. And Charles, I appreciate you coming on the show. And one question that I ask every single one of our guests is, if you could share one piece of advice for drivers out there, and this can be tailored to the recruiting process or just with your experience of just living a healthier and happier life, what would you tell a driver?
I've been there, I've done it. So my advice to you is ask questions, look for that balance, and take time for yourself. It's a hard job out there. It's stressful. It's easy to sit there and get sucked into it, but always make time for yourself, because if you can't do the job, then none of this freight's getting delivered, and you're the most important piece of this puzzle. So always take time for yourself, always focus on putting your health first, and always focus on some balance in your mental and physical life.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I appreciate you coming on, and I'm excited for everyone listening to this, because I think this conversation was helpful for drivers and people who work, as recruiters and in the trucking industry outside of driving. So I appreciate you coming on. You shared a ton of great knowledge, and I appreciate our friendship and everything. And we'll definitely have you on the podcast again. And everyone listening, thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Trucking, big wheels there humming, high rate of fuel consumption, missing mama, needing loving, rolling with the weight and sound, running like the Southern Shaker. I don't need no 40 acres to turn this rig around. I'm jacked up like a Chevy, but ain't heading to the levee. Lord have mercy sakes alive. On this high step and double clutching, gear jamming, chicken trucking, old school.